Hello, and welcome to this World Investment Forum session on the investment, trade, and development nexus in the post-COVID era. Thank you to UNCTAD and the WTO for co-organizing this session. I'm Sean Doherty, Head of Trade and Investment at the World Economic Forum. Now, the premise of this session is that global value chains will be reconfigured in the aftermath of COVID, and countries may therefore want to review their trade and investment strategies. International policy may also need to be reconsidered so as to best support development. And so to talk us through these changes and what we should do about them, we are joined by, I think, perhaps the best cast ever assembled on a Zoom stage. We're going to start with two high-level addresses, first from WTO Deputy Director General Jiangxin Chen, then from UNCTAD Deputy Secretary General Isabelle Durand. We'll then move on through the rest of the session. So to launch, let's hear first from Deputy Director General Jiang, please.
Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very pleased to join you today and would like to applaud UNCTAD's efforts to organize this high-level World Investment Forum, as well as this session on the investment, trade, and development nexus together with the WTO. This year marks the third time that we hold this session together. I would like to begin by assuring that trade and investment drivers past just 30 years, in particular in global value chains, has been a force for economic diversification, job creation, and development. With servicification and digitization, global value chains have made trade and investment flows increasingly interlinked and mutually reinforcing. They are the two sides of the same coin. The imperative to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic has made this twin role of trade and investment flows more important than ever before. The pandemic has brought massive disruption to all aspects of our social and economic lives. In particular, it has acted as a massive stress test both for the world trade and the investment, causing unprecedented shocks to global value chains. In 2020, the value of global trade in goods and services fell by 9.6%. Global investment was hit much harder, with FDI flows falling more deeply by 35%. Greenfield projects in developing countries, which are key for industrial and infrastructure development, fell by 42% in 2020. Today's hyper-connected global economy has made the world more susceptible to shocks, but it has also made it more resilient when they strike. The multilateral trading system has again stood the test of time more than many expected, as its core principles and rules helped to prevent the world from sliding into a full-fledged protectionism. Specifically, the reality check shows that while the pandemic brought strains on the global value chains, and there are problems, e.g. semiconductor scarcity and port backlogs, there has been no such as a total breakdown. The dip in world merchandise and the services trade during the pandemic has been significantly smaller than the one during the 2008 to 2009 global financial crisis. Goods have continued to flow across the borders, as many economies have gradually begun to recover a bit unevenly. Services trade, such as sectors related to travel and leisure, business, financial, and telecom services, witnessed growth of 60% in 2021 due to their ability to go online. Foreign direct investment flows rebound less quickly than trade flows, largely because investors' confidence is more prone to uncertainty. With technological advancement and the waves of digitization, trade and investment nexus become even stronger. They serve as twin engines to power the world economic recovery from the pandemic. Particularly, they are crucial for developing and least developed countries with small internal markets and limited ability to spur recovery through physical stimulus packages. They are vital to operate the much-needed shift towards a more sustainable, greener, and digital economy, to build forward better and enhance resilience. This is a pressing imperative in the face of increasingly frequent and more intense natural and man-made disasters. On the trade front, it cannot be emphasized enough of the important enabling role of the services sectors. Services and the services trade are glue and inputs to global value chains with increased value addition to GVC exports. On the investment front, FDI patterns have shifted towards more resilient and diversified supply chains as well as feasible recovery investment packages, notably on the energy transition, green technologies, digital and physical infrastructure, and health. Therefore, support for manufacturing, services, digitization, and environmental sustainability are priorities and need to be elevated in the national development policy agenda. At the same time, expanding trade and investment and strengthening economic resilience will require more trade and investment cooperation at the multilateral, trilateral, and regional level. A transparent, predictable, and business-friendly environment is key for trade and investment to flourish. Next to existing WTO agreements, ongoing Joint Statement Initiative, so-called JSI, on services-based regulations, e-commerce, and investment facilitation for development, aim at reducing trade and investment costs and enhancing transparency and the predictability of national regulations and administrative procedures. WTO recent studies have shown that there is a positive correlation between reduction of red tapes and improved economic performance and gains. Let me briefly elaborate on the negotiations on the agreement on investment facilitation for development. The initiative aims to improve the overall investment and the business climate, making it easier for investors to invest, conduct their day-to-day business, and expand. Since their start, participants have explicitly excluded market access, investment protection, and investor-state dispute settlement from the negotiations. Special and differential treatment and technical assistance and capacity building are built in as key pillar of the agreement to benefit the developing and the least developed members in their implementation. Discussions are currently ongoing among over 100 WTO members from all regions and at all levels of development. Participating members in the initiative are aiming to achieve a concrete outcome by the next WTO Ministerial Conference to be held in Geneva in just over a month. Ultimately, facilitating investment is in everyone's best interest. Let me conclude with two brief remarks. First, we will be able to overcome the current pandemic and emerge stronger from it only through more cooperation, more transparency, and more capacity building. Second, we will be able to reduce the funding gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals only if trade and investment are facilitated to thrive jointly and expand sustainably. In both the WTO and UNCTAD have a critical role to play. I am therefore extremely pleased to see today that our two organizations stand ready to reinforce and deepen our cooperation to achieve these common goals. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that, Deputy Director General Zhang. Let's turn now to UNCTAD. So, Deputy Secretary General, congratulations on the World Investment Forum so far, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Shen. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for joining us today at this meeting, which takes place at a significant moment. Not only the World Investment Forum, but the fact that we are almost 2 years into the pandemic, which has had an enormous impact and is still not over. Yet the recovery is underway, and we have an opportunity to create more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive economies. Global value chains boosted trade and investment for over 3 decades and were an engine of the global economy. But the COVID-19 pandemic brought them close to breaking point. In 2020, international investment declined by 35% to $1 trillion, reaching its lowest level since 2005. International trade also experienced an historic fall. In 2020, merchandise trade fell by 7.3% and services trade by 20%. Yet, GVCs did not break, that's true. After the initial shock, global value chains have proven to be responsive and vital. Trade started recovering strongly at the end of 2020, but then trade growth slowed down in the course of 2021. International investment is now also recovering. Global FDI flows in the first half of 2021 reached an estimated $850 billion. That means that it has recovered more than 70% from last year's loss. Still, we have to remain vigilant. The investment recovery appears to be driven mostly by the push for infrastructure investment. FDI in industrial sector and global supply chains is still stagnant. Concern about the fragility of global value chains are thus not subsiding. We have seen the repercussion that failings in global supply chains can do, especially in healthcare equipment and medicines, but also in virtually manufacturing industries. While the crisis has further increased the challenges of international production, several other factors had already started transforming the system prior to the pandemic. In our 2020 World Investment Report, we examined various challenges and how they are expected to transform the global system of international production in this decade. We analyzed the implication of emerging trends, such as the downsides of reshoring, the drive towards regionalization, or the desire for diversification of supply chains. During the WIF this week and 2 days ago, we also discussed in another panel the issue of the opportunities, role, and influence of SMEs in global value chains. All these trajectories have important implications for policymakers in trade, investment, and development. Certainly, international production is vital for the recovery, economic growth, but also job creation. It is important to maintain an open trade and investment policy environment that favors a gradual rather than a shock adjustment of international production network. In developing countries, especially, policymakers need to prepare for the challenges arising from the expected gradual transformation of international production and be ready to capture the opportunities and attract the investment that is required. To this end, we are really pleased to see progress in investment facilitation in discussion at the WTO, as it was just said. Investment facilitation is critical for reducing uncertainty for investors. It contains many aspects and tools, such as the use of ombudspersons, dispute prevention approaches, and consultation mechanisms. This aspect must be familiar to you as they echo the success achieved in trade facilitation. What we have learned from trade facilitation on the ground and from our experience with foreign investors is the immense value of information provision and transparency, streamlining and automation of administrative procedures. These are gains that governments can quickly seize, as often they do not require legislative changes, only changes in the way rules are implemented. And in this context, I would like to mention our Global Enterprise Registration Index, which rates countries' information portals and single windows for business and investors. Information portals provide guidance on required procedures to invest, establish and operate a business, or obtain necessary trading licenses and permits. Single windows enable investors to create a company online. Our index builds on our pioneering work on transparency and online single windows across developing countries. We work a lot with governments in order to simplify procedures, often cutting the number of steps, time, and cost to businesses by half or more. We then automate these procedures through online single windows. This avoids numerous visits to multiple government offices, excessive paperwork, and opportunities for excessive discretion. Thanks to this work, for instance, Benin and Bhutan are among the fastest places in the world to create a business, and both are least developed countries. So we hope to build on this experience with you and help focus investment in facilitation efforts on those issues that matter most to investors and which make the biggest difference to mobilizing investment for sustainable development. I thank you for your attention, and I wish us, a fruitful discussion.
Great, thank you very much. So I think after those two interventions, we now have a very good outline of some of the challenges and opportunities ahead of us. We've heard about the need for cooperation, for transparency and capacity building to simplify and to reduce uncertainty. So as to be sure that we have a solid grounding in the statistics and the economic analysis of what is happening in trade and investment in this somewhat turbulent period, we're now going to be treated to two presentations of the 2021 World Trade Report and the World Investment Report. And so for the first of these, let's turn to Marc Paqueta, who is Chief of Section at the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the WTO. Marc, over to you.
Okay, let me quickly upload my slides. Can you see my slides in full screen?
Not yet. No, try again.
Sorry, let me try again. Sorry.
Now they're appearing.
Okay. I'm trying to, trying to change the way you see that. Okay, now it's working. I'm sorry about that.
Well, now we see with the black edges. So
sorry.
Now we go. Perfect. Over to you.
Took too long. Okay, so let me start with my presentation. Good morning, everyone. This is a presentation on the 2021 World Trade Report, which will only be issued on November 16. So it's an advanced presentation, if you wish. The WTR is the WTO's flagship publication, and this year it looks at 3 questions. It is on discusses the issue of economic resilience and trade, and addresses 3 main questions. The first one is, why does economic resilience matter? And on this, we look at various shocks and risks and how they will actually evolve in the future. And we think that they will become more prevalent in the world economy and affect many more countries. We look at how these shocks affect economies and trade, and how governments actually respond to those shocks. The second question we address is, what is the role of trade in economic resilience, and how can trade at the same time spread shocks and strengthen resilience? The third question we focus on in the report is, what is the role of international cooperation in building economic resilience, and how the WTO and other forms of international cooperation can help. These are all pressing questions, in our view, in light of the prospect of increasingly frequent and more intense natural and man-made disasters. I'll start with the 3 main messages, and then I'll say a few more words about each of them. But basically, what the report shows is that, first, globalization has made the world more vulnerable to shocks, but at the same time more resilient to them when they strike. The second main finding is that policies that aim to increase economic resilience by reshoring production, by promoting self-sufficiency, or by unwinding trade integration can often and have often had the opposite effect, effectively reducing economic resilience. The third main message is that strengthening economic resilience will require more global cooperation. This is a message that has already been expressed by in the 2 previous presentations. Now, globalization is, in our view, indeed, at the same time, a challenge and a solution. Globalization has made the world increasingly complex, integrated, and interdependent. Today's interconnected economies are more exposed to shocks and more dependent on international trade and production networks that can easily be disrupted by a number of shocks that range from the pandemic, for instance, to the global financial crisis, or to some natural catastrophes. At the same time, however, interconnected economies have more scope to diversify their sources of supply, to pool their collective resources, to share information and expertise, and, thanks to material and technological progress, to withstand shocks. The second main finding is with regard to the idea that isolation is not the solution. And we look at how restrictive trade measures disrupted supply chains, slowed production, and increased insecurity, while at the same time, trade actually contributed to ensure that critical goods, services, and medical supplies continue to flow. Networked economies with global value chains are better placed than isolated ones to pool resources, to share expertise, and diversify their sources of supply. This explains why many countries, after initially imposing export restrictions to preserve their domestic supply and to promote made-at-home solutions, ended up reversing them. Open and competitive markets are remarkably adaptable and efficient, in our view. Accelerating digitalization and automation have helped to facilitate and underpin this adaptation. Obviously, addressing the digital divide is absolutely key to ensuring that LDCs and vulnerable groups can benefit from digitally enabled resilience strategies. This chart actually shows how, during the pandemic, more trade facilitating measures were put in place than trade restrictive measures, and how more trade restrictive measures were phased out than trade facilitating measures. Now, I'll spend a little bit of time discussing the issue of cooperation. We strongly believe that more resilience will require more cooperation. And so we focus on the role of the WTO, but we also discuss how other forms of international cooperation can help. The benefits of globalization are not shared widely or equally enough. And this leaves the world economy less resilient than it could be. And that's one of the reasons why cooperation is so important. Trade cooperation can help achieve more open markets and more inclusive, stable, and predictable trade that promotes diversification of products, of suppliers, of markets, and thereby will improve resilience to shocks. Cooperation can also promote greater transparency, information sharing, and predictability in the global marketplace. It can help countries to better assess production capacities, to avoid bottlenecks, to manage inventories, and to prevent excessive stockpiling. International cooperation, as I just mentioned, on trade can take place at various levels. We'll obviously focus, because we at the WTO, we will focus on the multilateral level, but obviously other levels matter too, notably the plurilateral level or the regional level. We consider both to all those levels in the report. The WTO already plays a key role in advancing trade cooperation and in making economies more resilient through disciplines limiting members' discretion to adopt policies causing negative cross-border spillovers, while supporting policies that create or expand positive spillovers. Among the major contributions are the fact that the WTO contributes to reduce trade barriers, to streamline customs procedures, to encourage transparency and predictability of policies, to build trade capacity in poorer countries, trade for trade, amongst others, to collaborate with other international organizations, to strengthen the global economy and make it more secure. As the COVID-19 pandemic took hold, the WTO Secretariat engaged in collaboration with other international organizations in a number of important trade-related health initiatives that provide information, transparency, policy support, technical cooperation, and capacity building. Ongoing negotiations at the WTO on services, on investment, on agriculture, on electronic commerce, on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises could create further opportunities for inclusive trade and diversification, and thereby contribute to making economies more resilient in the future. The WTO's upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference offers an opportunity for members to advance on these fronts and ensure that trade and the open, non-discriminatory, rules-based multilateral trading system of the WTO will continue to support economic resilience. I'm done, so I don't know. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Very, very interesting indeed. And I'm pleased to see that the statistics that we've had more trade facilitating measures put in place than trade restrictive ones over the last period. That's very encouraging. And also, I think a very important point right at the beginning of your slides with this seemingly contradictory point that globalization makes us both more vulnerable and more resilient. And perhaps we need to improve our collective vocabulary to sort of understand this not really that necessarily sophisticated concept, which is one which features in old metaphors of the tree which sways in the wind but doesn't fall over. So I think there might be something we want to explore there. But let's move on and complement that introduction with some highlights from the World Investment Report, explained by Richard Bolwine, who's head of investment trends and the issues branch in the division on investment and enterprise at UNCTAD. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. And thanks, Mark, for providing us some early insights into the World Trade Report coming up. Let me try to share my screen as well, if I'm as tech savvy as you are. Please let me know if you can see what's coming.
We can see it. Ah, there we go. Perfect.
Perfect. Great. So I have put together just a few things on our World Investment Report. I have only a few minutes, but nevertheless, I've taken the liberty to combine a few pictures from last year's World Investment Report with those for this year's World Investment Report. And the reason for that, Sean, you introduced a session already talking about the expected transformation of international production. And that was, of course, the theme of our report last year. So I thought let's discuss a little bit of both and take it as the starting point for the presentation of this year's World Investment Report. And well, we had a very long analysis. Ms. Durand already gave a few hints of the various trajectories we painted for international production over the coming decades. I've tried to synthesize all of that in just 10 points here. And even those, because I have only a few minutes, I will synthesize even further. Basically, what we predicted last year in our World Investment Report for international production, for GVCs, is a shrinking pool of investment in physical assets, reduced investment or downward pressure on investment in physical assets. Pressure on value capture from GVC activities. It's a mainstay of development advice we have given to developing countries. Focus on attracting activities in global value chain, increasing GVC participation, but value capture in that is going to become increasingly difficult. And the last point I would focus on is the expected changes in the drivers and determinants of investment, which can make it more difficult for developing countries to attract investment. So those were sort of gloomy points we got from on international production from last year's analysis. But there were also a few positive points, especially you see on at the bottom there of that list of 10 points, the expected increase in infrastructure investment. You could almost call that a shift from industry investment to infrastructure investment, right? Where industry is global supply chains, global value chains, it's manufacturing capacity. Infrastructure is physical roads, etc., power, but also things like renewable energy. In fact, the 10th point there is green economy. And if we look at the trends today, that's the fastest growing international investment sector. And our DSG already mentioned there were a few challenges we highlighted last year, but we also highlighted a few opportunities. So the investment impact of international production transformation can translate into divestments, reshoring, we hear that a lot, relocations, investment diversion, but it can also provide an opportunity to attract investment or attract investors that are looking to diversify supply chains for increased resilience. At the same time, the shrinking pool of efficiency-seeking investment that I mentioned earlier has a flip side, and it can also lead to opportunities for market-seeking FDI and especially regional market-seeking FDI. The value capture in GVCs, as I said, is going to become more difficult, but we also see shorter value chains and more investments in final goods production. So that's an opportunity there for developing countries to explore. And the last one there, diminishing returns on infrastructure built for a world of GVCs. And what we mean with that is there's a lot of special economic zones out there, always aiming for the largest possible industrial investment. And that's exactly the type of investment we're seeing less of. And we're seeing more investment that is dependent on digital infrastructure and sort of lean type of infrastructure provision, all including in special economic zones built for a different type of international production. All of this, however, though, these challenges and opportunities on both sides, they do imply that there are big implications for the investment strategies of developing countries. So this was, in a nutshell, our conclusions from last year. This year's report, of course, we always open with the big picture and the big number, but Mr. Zhang already mentioned the number, the minus 35%. Last that we saw as an impact on FDI last year as a result of the pandemic. So I don't need to expand on that. Let's see where that minus 35% came from, right? We have in UNCTAD developed a productive capacity index, and it has it's built up of many different parts. It's many different components. So you see here ICT, energy, private sector development, transportation, structural change. These are just the, focusing on developing countries, the types of investments that we would like to have to build productive capacity. And of course, last year, during the pandemic, ICT was the part that didn't suffer, right? Investment in the digital economy continued its upward trend, but almost all the other types of investment that are important for building productive capacity declined very significantly. Now, the reaction, of course, of governments and, well, governments mostly in the developed economies, but also multilateral development banks and some large emerging markets. The reaction has been to come up with rescue packages, recovery packages. And the rescue packages and recovery packages are made up of different components. Most of it, of course, during the pandemic was what we call rescue. It's basically direct expenditure, income support. Not aimed at long-term investment, but a significant component in any case is aimed at investment retention, keeping business afloat, meaning guaranteeing future investment flows. But also direct investment now in the infrastructure packages that have already been defined in Europe. They are still underway in the US, but they are also being defined in many other countries. In fact, here you see the big numbers, they come from the IMF. But if I just pick the part that is investment generation, so aimed at long-term investment, mostly in infrastructure, it's already worth, worldwide, it's already worth about 3.5 trillion. So it's a very big chunk. Unfortunately, only about 10% of that has been adopted by and is aimed at developing economies. So very big unbalance there, but it's still the case that even if the largest chunk of it goes to developed economies, it will affect, through spillover effects, FDI flows worldwide. One of the biggest challenges with such a large number to be invested in infrastructure is implementing it, right? The absorptive capacity and the implementation capacity of such a big boost to infrastructure investment is going to be sizable. Here we just projected the worldwide growth in infrastructure investment over the past 10 years. And you see that the fastest growth rate we tend to achieve is 7%. But the implied growth rate as a result of the investment or recovery investment packages is 3 times as high as that for several years running. So that will be a big challenge to implement that and implement that on time. And let me move towards conclusion. I'm just going to present you with the last slide, which is an update. It's not WIR, it's the Global Investment Trends Monitor that we launched this week. And it basically shows you that some of the points I put on that first slide, if you recall, with our expected trends, the increase in infrastructure investment and the downward pressure on industry investment is really playing out here. This is the first half of 2021, right? Actually, for the right-hand side of this slide, which is project data, it's 3 quarters of 2021. And you see that industry investment, meaning investment in the typical industries we associate with global value chains, global supply chains, is still on a downward trend, whereas the investment in infrastructure is already growing quite rapidly. In fact, the biggest chunk of that infrastructure investment is renewable energy. So that's a positive, a very positive development. At the same time, one of our conclusions already in this year's World Investment Report and confirmed now by the Trends Monitor is that we do need to seek a balance between promoting infrastructure investment and industry investment. We need to, it is obvious for governments that the first point of call is infrastructure investment, because it's more easy for governments to intervene in that, right? In that type of investment. At the same time, you can build roads, but if there is no trucks to go on it, it doesn't help. So we do feel we need to make sure we balance that with initiatives to promote private sector industrial investment. And the investment facilitation in industry, of course, certainly helps. On the left-hand side of the picture, that's more worrisome, right? It's there's a huge unevenness in the recovery. So in the first half of this year, an enormous increase already. These are partial year growth rates, so we don't know how they're going to play out at the end of the year. But partial year growth rates indicate that practically all of the recovery so far is taking place in the high-income economies, and the low-income economies are still on a downward path. And that's another concern, of course, for us. I'll conclude with this, and back to you, Sean.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. Very, very helpful to get that sectoral breakdown in particular, and also the view on the uses of the recovery package. Extremely helpful. So now that we are sufficiently armed with data, we're going to dive in a minute into the reactions, the analysis, policy proposals, and practical views of business. Before I turn to the rest of the panel, though, I know that Deputy Secretary General Durand will need to leave us shortly. So maybe I'd like to turn to you to see whether you have any parting thoughts or reactions to what we've just heard.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. It's true, I have to leave, and it's why I wanted just very briefly, first of all, thank WTO to have proposed this disclose of the report of the WTO. I think that it's very interesting to have that now, even before the MC12. And to react to that, just to highlight the fact that when we speak about international cooperation, which is absolutely key, I think that we have to really give emphasis to multilateral cooperation. I feel that the regional or even the plurilateral cooperation, of course, is important, but it's for me more by default. I mean, it has to be temporary, or it has to be when there is no other ways. But the best option, and that's of course our wish to from all of us, is a multilateral cooperation within the WTO. And the second thing that I wanted to just to highlight is the fact that yes, reshaping value chain is now key, and we have seen very well which are the challenges, the opportunities, the risks, but also what could be useful. And I think that what Richard just said about green investment and how today the investment is increasing, especially in infrastructure in those green sector, has also to be accompanied in a way which is helping also green development. We have the COP26 next week. A lot of decisions I hope, have to be taken regarding adaptation for developing countries and funding this adaptation. It's also related to investment in infrastructure, also in industry and services, of course, but also we see that the trend is in investment in infrastructure. And I hope that we can together, WTO, UNCTAD and other partners, try to accompany these trends in the good direction in order to really help and support the adaptation of the developing countries in green investment, green infrastructure, and I hope a recovery which is more adapted to the challenges of the more or less post-COVID period. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of you. And I welcome, of course, very warmly the excellent panelists who will speak after me. And speaking from different parts of the world, it's very important to listen to them in order to see how, from their point of view, they are really see how the things could evolve in the next period. So thank you to all of you, and have a good discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, that is a perfect link through to the 5 thoughtful decision makers who are now going to suggest some perhaps practical reactions and ways forward, building on everything we've heard now. So the 5 people we're going to hear from are, in order, Mr. Sung-Wan Lee, who is the Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea, Mr. Carlo Pettinato, who is Head of Unit Investment and Intellectual Property at the European Commission, Mr. Joel K. Richards, who is a Senior Specialist for Trade, at the permanent delegation of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Mr. Miguel Vega Pestana, who is Head of Corporate Affairs and Head of Sustainability at Reckitt, and Ms. Kalina Manova, who is a Professor of Economics and Deputy Department Head at University College London. So we'll hear from each of them in turn, and then I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, agreements, disagreements, and requests to deal with. So first, let's turn to you, Mr. Songwan Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doty, for giving me the floor, and thank you for the invitation once again to both UNCTAD and the WTO. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion, and just as a primer, perhaps, many may wonder why Korea would be the first to speak among the governments here. I think one deserves an explanation as to the relationship between ODI, so foreign direct investment, in Korea. Indeed, Korea, as UNCTAD points out, is one of the top 10 sources of outward foreign direct investment. We invested $32 billion overseas last year. So we're actually a net exporter of capital. And indeed, interestingly, we are one of only 5 countries in the world that have consistently had a net surplus of exported capital vis-a-vis FDI. So for 7 years in a row, we've exported more capital overseas. We've invested more capital overseas than have taken in to Korea. And obviously that would have some implications. Now, the other aspect which bears mentioning and which is indirectly relevant to our discussions today is the fact that Korean MNEs, so multinational companies, happen to be among the key foreign direct investors overseas. Indeed, we have 15 Korean companies, all of which are private sector companies that are in the Global 500 of Fortune magazine. And these are the key vehicles of Korean overseas direct investment. With that said, I would just go back to the World Investment Report that was just highlighted by UNCTAD. And I think it was a very helpful lay of the land, but what's also important is to be mindful of what was missing in that landscape, but which UNCTAD has in previous years very much focused on prior to the pandemic. And if anything, I think these are trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic itself. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to the fact that FDI, according to UNCTAD's own analysis, has been showing a rather anemic, a weak growth trend for the last 10 years prior to the pandemic. So we're talking about the 10-year decade, the decade between the global financial crisis and the pandemic, where on average, FDI actually grew by a paltry 1%, whereas I believe prior to 2008, it grew by 8% between 2000 and 2007. And of course, prior to 2000, it was the roaring decade for FDI, where FDI actually grew by 20%. And this is extremely important because one has to wonder whether anemic FDI growth is the norm that would be accelerated as a consequence of the pandemic. And based on what we've heard from both presenters, especially by UNCTAD, given all the reconfiguration, the political push for reshoring, perhaps this is a trend that is likely to continue and endure. And this has a bearing on the negotiations that are ongoing as well. At least it lurks on the thoughts of those that are negotiating here in Geneva on investment facilitation. The second point that is worth highlighting in the UNCTAD report, I believe, and that is directly pertinent to our negotiations as well, is the fact that we've seen in recent years an acceleration of the adoption of investment regulating and investment restrictive measures. Of course, in absolute terms, the investment facilitating and investment promoting measures are actually exceed the number of restrictive measures, but we're seeing a greater incidence and a greater share of investment restrictive or regulating measures in recent years. What's even more interesting, according to UNCTAD, is the fact that the vast majority of these investment restricting measures are adopted by developed countries, whereas the vast majority of investment facilitating or promoting measures are being adopted by developing countries. So in this respect, I think it's very promising. It bodes well for increasing and channeling FDI into developing countries to support their sustainable development, that we're seeing a greater incidence of an adoption of investment facilitating measures by developing countries. But with that said, we also hear studies that suggest that although new increments of investment facilitating measures are being done mostly by developing countries, yet the total stock or the total cumulative total of investment facilitating measures is still far too few and minuscule in developing or LDC countries compared to developed countries. And therefore, they would have to adopt more investment facilitating measures to make sure that they can reap the benefits of these investment facilitating measures. So the fact that developing countries are adopting these investment facilitation measures offer a very good start, and it bodes well for the future. But at the same time, I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what these investment facilitation measures, as well as what the investment facilitation agreement can do and cannot do. Obviously, the investment facilitation measures in developing countries and whatnot can enhance transparency, reduce uncertainty, as was mentioned by Didi Zhang. But they don't guarantee greater inflows of FDI, just as higher rankings on the Ease of Business Index necessarily guarantee higher FDI. It was mentioned, however, by the WTO DDG that reduced red tape has a strong correlation with stronger economic performance. And I think that's an important point. It would correlate with stronger economic performance, but does not necessarily correlate. We don't have any guarantees that it would correlate with stronger inflows of FDI, just as BITs don't necessarily show strong correlations with greater FDI. So then why do this? Why should developing countries undertake these long, arduous process of reform that aren't easy for many LDC countries? Well, I think we can think of a couple of reasons why developing countries would do well to continue to advance these reforms that are aimed at administrative good governance. The first is it provides an imprimatur of good governance that will not go unnoticed by potential investors. It will be one of those other boxes to tick to see whether countries have signed on to the IFD agreement, to see whether they've actually adopted these investment facilitating, these sound, predictable investment environments. And that would obviously be an important, although not a decisive factor, it would certainly be a meaningful factor as investors choose and decide on their investment locations. Another, I think, extension of this point is that what are the implications for those that are left outside the IFD agreement, outside the investment facilitation agreement? Well, it suggests to investors that there's one less box to click because we're not sure that these countries have actually adopted these robust, good governance, modernized administrative measures for facilitating investments. Now, the second point, why should this matter if it doesn't necessarily correlate with higher investment inflows? Because it helps to mobilize domestic resources. And because domestic resources are also part and parcel of driving and advancing economic growth. So I think UNCTAD's analysis is also very important here. It shows that SIDS countries, small island developing countries, have a higher ratio of FDI. They rely on a higher ratio of FDI for their gross capital formation, meaning they have more to gain from these investment facilitating measures. And I think interestingly, that's why we tend to see a lot of SIDS countries that are also present here in this room as well, making such constructive proposals for investment facilitation. This leads to my final point about what can developed countries do, what can countries like Korea do, donor countries like Korea do as well. I think it's given the political atmospherics of weakening middle class and job creation back at home, it's hard to say that we should facilitate outward investments. What we can do, however, is to ensure that whatever investments are made overseas are in compliance with good ethical behavior, with good ESG business conduct, and with responsible business conduct. And that's why Korea values very much the inclusion of such responsible business conduct language in the IFD agreement. And we're encouraging our businesses domestically, and we're putting in place by various systems to encourage ESG business strategies as they go overseas as well. And lastly, of course, it's also important to prime the pump. And what governments can do, what donor governments can do, is also make sure that our ODAs, our aid for trade, are not adversely affected by the pandemic. And we make sure that we also channel greater aid to green transformation, digital transformations, as well as more aid to technical assistance that would help these developing countries and LDCs implement these investment facilitating measures. So on there. Thank you, Sean.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's go straight now to the EU and to Carlo. Your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sean, and I'm delighted to participate in this panel and to see some of my fellow negotiators here in the WTO investment facilitation, but also some distinguished experts. I think I'll try to focus a little bit on the questions and the issues for debate in these few minutes. And of course, the first, I think, what are the most promising trade investment strategies? I think that has been pretty clearly explained. I think from the beginning, there is no question that the EU firmly believes in an open trade and investment policy, particularly if we're talking about developing countries, but for all countries, of course. And the fact that the response, I think it was very well explained, the response to the crisis and the recovery, but this is a response to any period. I think the crisis has made that even more urgent and more visible, is the fact that the isolation is not the solution. And in order to build more resilience to future shocks, I think that the diversification of the global value chains is something that we have to absolutely continue. So we fully believe in that. As far as the European Union is concerned, how does that translate in practice? If we think about our plans of engagement with developing countries, with vulnerable developing countries, particularly in the proximity, what we call the neighborhood, and with Africa, is absolutely to promote sustainable development at the core, both in internal but also external policies, the twin transition towards a green and more digital economy, and that translate directly in our relationships with the neighborhood. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the other question, which was the policy gap, where do we see a policy gap? And I find it remarkable reading back to some of the papers and the documents that UNCTAD very appropriately produced in 2015, 2016. I think it was UNCTAD that produced the first global action menu on investment facilitation. And reading the 10 actions, it's rather remarkable how they are reflected in the topics that we are discussing, negotiating today at the WTO investment facilitation. And UNCTAD remarked at the time that there is a certain gap in international investment policy because this aspect is not enough reflected in international multilateral instruments. Well, I think we have a very clear opportunity. So I think the international community has actually listened very carefully to that and to the suggestions that came from UNCTAD and others, of course, and to fill that gap. So we are in a way trying to fill that gap, and as Sung-Wan was saying, it's not just because we needed to fill the gap from a theoretic point of view, but there's a very, very real reason, and I think we all realized that the good governance aspect is as important, in some cases even more important, than some other aspects of traditional investment rulemaking. And I mean, I find it striking that the World Bank, competitiveness report produced, consistently this, and the surveys on international investors, particularly as regards their operations in developing countries, they show that for instance, in case of lack of transparency, sudden regulatory changes, delays in obtaining permits and approvals, about 1 in 4 investments totally withdrew an existing FDI project or canceled a planned expansion owing to those particular, they call them political risks, which are exactly the kind of risks and costs, I would say, that can be reduced through investment facilitation. So these are problems and restrictions that are far more frequently encountered by foreign investors than the more extreme risks that are breach of contract or expropriation and taking of property that, of course, have a much bigger impact, but they are far less frequently. So the sum of all those regular problems encountered, lack of transparency and administrative procedures, they have overall perhaps an even bigger impact taken altogether. So it can make a real difference. The WTO initiative is not just an initiative, it's the objective. The stated objective is to produce an agreement, a WTO agreement, and it is precisely with the purpose of increasing the participation of developing and least developed countries in foreign direct investment, in global foreign direct investment, meaning in global value chain. So this is something, it's a big opportunity that I think we should try to take. The fact that you know, the funding gap to achieve the SDGs and all that makes it perhaps even more urgent to do that. We should also highlight the fact that the special and differential treatment aspects and capacity building for the implementation of these provisions of this agreement that we hope will emerge soon from the WTO is an integral part and is a cornerstone. We know very well, based, and we heard here on the experience of the trade facilitation agreement, that this aspect is absolutely necessary, and the European Union stands ready with our development assistance program to be part of this. And I think, in my view, and we're discussing precisely these days, how are we going to make this happen? And I think the participation of international organizations such as UNCTAD, that has a direct experience, as we just heard, in concrete actions on the ground to help countries improve their regulatory framework and to implement what we call investment facilitation measures, will be key in the success of the implementation of this agreement. So I hope really that the UNCTAD will be present here, because it would be highly valued contribution. As regards let's say the spillover of the understanding of the importance of investment facilitation, I would say is not just in the WTO, although we heard from Mrs. Durand that the ideal is always multilateral. The best policy options are always multilateral on trade and investment, and I fully agree on that. But bilaterally, we're also taking that on board, because we were not the first ones to negotiate investment facilitation agreement, but now we're doing it. The European Union, we've started negotiations with, we've heard some countries that were interested. We have started negotiations with Angola. We have incorporated investment facilitation also in our negotiations with the Southern Eastern African group. So this is something that we intend to develop further also in our as part of our investment policy. It's not replacing anything. It's an additional component for us of our international investment policy. Allow me just one final word. I participated in other panels, in one other panel this week, the one on international investment agreements, where every speaker explains, including us, the beauty of our approach in our international agreements and how good we are. And I heard a chorus of support for sustainable development, sustainable investment. I wish this chorus could also be translated into introducing and agreeing to introduce also on investment facilitation in the negotiations we're having in the WTO, equally ambitious provisions on sustainable investment. We have proposed something. We hope that aspect, that section, that chapter will include important provisions, and so we invite everyone to follow that and to follow that ambition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. That's a clear call to action. Let's turn to the Caribbean now, and Joel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and let me thank UNCTAD and the WTO as well for the invitation. I want to do two things in my intervention today. One is to present a picture of how the COVID situation has really impacted on the trade and investment situation in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States countries. We did get some data from the presentation from Richard, for example, but there is sometimes a tendency in, and this is not necessarily the case in terms of the World Investment Report, but there are times when as small island developing states in the Caribbean, we tend to be marginalized and captured in general data that speaks to the Latin American region. And sometimes the situation isn't disaggregated in a way to look at our own unique situation. So I thought I would take the opportunity today to address some of those gaps in terms of how global data is sometimes captured and presented. And I want to also address some of the questions that have been posed as issues for debates, and those would be the latter two questions. And in terms of the impact of COVID and looking at this whole idea of investment, trade, and development nexus, what we have observed, and we've done some analysis in collaboration with the Commonwealth Secretariat in terms of the real trade and investment impact of the pandemic, and we've looked at some of our national data that we've been collecting as well. And what we have observed is that the COVID pandemic has adversely affected and disrupted trade, travel, tourism-related services, and these have had the impact of inducing a deep recession in our economies. As a result, the gross domestic product, the GDP, in all 6 countries of the OECS, which are members of the WTO, in 2020 declined from 4% and 19%, and that was in 2020 alone. And what we found is that there's been a latent impact as well, so that the figures for 2021 are not much more encouraging than this. And so essentially what we've assessed is that had the pandemic not occurred, the combined GDP of these 6 countries would have been as much as $1.2 billion higher in 2020. And this is an enormous amount in the context of very small open economies. In some OECS member states, we have experienced COVID-induced fiscal gaps, and we've seen in some instances where fiscal deficits have widened anywhere between 5 and 13% of GDP. Again, these are enormous figures for very small economies. With respect to the direct impact on trade, especially our exports, our analysis suggests that had the COVID pandemic not occurred, our exports in absolute terms would have been as much as US $800 million higher than they actually were. So again, this is $800 million in export revenue that's been foregone as a result of the pandemic. What is unfortunate is that these GDP and trade losses are unlikely to be recovered anytime soon, because the direct and indirect effects of the pandemic are likely to linger for many, many more years to come. And this too bears testimony to an argument that we consistently make as small island developing states, and that is that we tend to be the hardest hit, and we also tend to take much longer to recover in the face of these kinds of global exogenous shocks. Now, my friend from Korea made an important point earlier when he said that Korea is a net capital exporting country. It's a net exporter of FDI. We are the opposite. So we are net capital importing countries. We are net seekers of FDI. And what we've seen is that there's also been a concomitant COVID-induced reduction in our investment intake. So of the 6 OECD WTO members, for example, only 1 has recorded an increase in FDI between 2019 and 2020. And we've had recorded drops in FDI as high as 80% at the upper limit for some of our countries. So I just wanted to present these figures to give you an idea of how the COVID situation has directly impacted on the trade and investment and GDP of our economies in a very direct way. Notwithstanding this, we strongly believe that trade and investment will play a critical role in our economic recovery. And if I may borrow a term that recently came out of the UNCTAD 15 conference, this notion of building forward better. And we believe that trade and investment will certainly be crucial in that regard. And generally, we see trade revenue, we see investment as well as being very critical in terms of filling some of our development gaps. And when I speak to development gaps, and I'm going to get to these later, but we do have gaps in terms of some of our social safety nets, in terms of infrastructure and so forth. And that's the role that we see trade and investment playing. Now, I'm going to come very specifically to the ongoing negotiations at the WTO on investment facilitation for development, because we do have 2 members of the OECS, Dominica and Grenada, which are active participants in these negotiations. And while the other 4 members are not formally part of the negotiation, they have been following these negotiations very carefully. And we see these negotiations as having a particular value added for countries like ours. So, and Carlo rightfully spoke to the UNCTAD global action menu earlier. And I actually found it interesting as well that some of the measures that we are pursuing in the investment facilitation context at the WTO dovetail very well with some of what's reflected in the UNCTAD global action menu. But the value added for us in terms of the WTO framework is to pursue reforms which are legally binding in an international instrument, and to pursue reforms for which we will be able to extract technical assistance and capacity building support to also implement. And that is very important for us. We also believe that if there's a critical mass of countries, both developing and developed, subscribing to high-level reform efforts, which are legally binding, which preclude the possibility of countries rolling back, then we believe that that in and of itself could be create a net positive impact with respect to the flow of investments across the world. And that's one of the reasons why we are also ourselves subscribing to this. There are certain efforts that we are also pursuing to complement what we're doing in the investment facilitation context. We are actively working towards pursuing industrial and export development strategies for our countries, because one of the problems that we have, and I noticed that in some of the figures presented by Richard, that we see that in some regards, investments are moving away from those industry type approaches and looking at more infrastructure and so forth. In economies like ours, which are very narrow and which are not as diversified as they need to be, trade and export development strategies and industrial strategies would also play a key role in terms of helping us to be able to channel capital in areas that we have earmarked for investments in terms of agriculture, manufacturing, and financial services, and others. The final point I want to get to well, the penultimate actually is with respect to this whole issue of sustainable investment, and Carlo alluded to it as well. But what we have observed is that the sustainable investment market is growing at a rate that supersedes the investments that we're used to. So those infrastructure investments, those industry-based investments. And so we, because of our experiences over the years with the impacts of climate change, impacts of natural disasters, we see the pursuit of sustainable financing and a solution for sustainable investment as very germane to our resilience and recovery efforts in these contexts. And so we're very interested in these kinds of investments. And the final point I want to make is in terms of the role of international organizations such as UNCTAD, such as the WTO. As part of the trade facilitation implementation process, UNCTAD devised a very forward-thinking program called the UNCTAD Empowerment Program, which assisted countries like ours in terms of their implementation efforts for the TFA. And we believe in the WTO context that UNCTAD can also play a similar role once we've concluded those negotiations on investment facilitation. And as it relates to the WTO's role, it plays a rule-making function. And that's exactly what we are doing in the context of the IFD. And international organizations in general do also have convening power. And I think they can exercise those convening powers to bring stakeholders together in a manner to assist countries, whether it be in terms of raising financing, assistance in reforms. That's the role that we think that some of these international organizations can play. And I will pause there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Joel, particularly for pulling us from the abstract to the very real challenges faced by smaller nations in particular. So let's now go to private sector. And Miguel, what's your perspective on these issues?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. And a big thank you also to both UNCTAD and WTO for inviting me to join you today. Now, hopefully some of you may have heard my CEO, Lakshman Narasaram, who participated in the opening session to the conference. And so apologies if some of the things I'm about to say sound very familiar, but of course, we're all joined up as a company. So we're a global hygiene and health and nutrition company, and we've got a portfolio of consumer brands like Dettol or Lysol or Durex, that are used by about 20 million people every single day in around 190 different countries around the world. And as you've already heard so eloquently from all my fellow panelists, it's absolutely true to say that COVID has had a disruptive impact on global trade flows and investment over the last 18 months or so. And for us, we see signs that this is actually going to continue for some time. And we certainly see significant supply chain disruption and trade headwinds impacting well into 22. And so this is undeniably changing the way that we run our business. So at the outset of COVID-19 restrictions, it's fair to say that every supply chain was very exposed. And in our own case, it was actually quite difficult to comprehend that personal protection products, like the Dettol brands that I mentioned earlier, which we saw from different markets, could all be stopped at the same time because of the different multiple lockdowns that were being introduced by different countries. And so this was something we'd never really imagined possible or had really planned for. And I don't think we were alone in that. And so our priority during this period has really been on three things. It's been to keep all of our 43,000 colleagues safe throughout this period. It's been to ensure the resilience of our global supply chains, and it's been to really continue to deliver on the needs and the expectations of our customers and our consumers, particularly because we're so focused on hygiene. Now, I think it's fair to say that we've had to work in really close cooperation with governments at all levels to maintain open free trade flows And that's really been key to enabling us to safeguard our ability to provide those basic life-saving hygienic products, as well as a range of other home and health and wellness brands. And over the period, we've actually increased capacity for some of our products by at least 5 times, and in other cases up to 20 times when you're talking about hygiene products. And we've had to do that by continuing to invest in capacity building with our supply chain partners, as well as by radically simplifying all of our product ranges. And that's meant that we've had to be incredibly agile and flexible. Now, we've then had to rethink our entire end-to-end value chains. And now we're starting to build that for greater future resilience. That's also focused on 3 other important considerations: how we build for a better environment, how we build in human capital, as well as business performance. And better business performance, I think it's important for us to recognize, is increasingly being defined by flexibility. And for us, that's a greater investment behind both e-commerce and digitization of our business. And we can expect certainly that a quarter of our sales over the next few years will be coming directly from e-commerce. And that's up, at the moment, it's up from 14% of our business today. So we continue to test, if you like, our supply chains to ensure that we can cope with the potential for future shocks. And then that's pretty important because I think there was a recent McKinsey study that has identified that such disruptions, like the one we've experienced and still are with COVID, are going to become more common. And it's predicted in their report that that we will see at least one major supply chain incident of at least a 1-month magnitude every three years or so. And so that's actually going to be critical to how we look at building that future resilience within day-to-day operations. And COVID's also really, and I think everyone has acknowledged it, has further exacerbated a lot of the questions and concerns about globalization. And as has been said so much by all my other fellow panelists, that's kind of what we call a globalization paradox, that all the issues that globalization is often being criticized for, and global supply chains are often being criticized for, are only actually addressed and solved by deeper cooperation and openness. And so as we're looking to kickstart the global economy, I think we all agree that we have to do that in ways that are going to be more inclusive and that do address some of those broader societal challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss, and of course the need to safeguard public health around the world. I think when we think about the resilience of supply chains, I do think it's worth calling out the investment in human capital. I thought it was really interesting statistic to see from the report that we just was shown a few minutes ago, where there was a 66% decline in investment in human capital. And we think that that's going to be key to the future success of certainly of our business. And that's everything from investing in the livelihoods of small farmers, or the treatment of migrant workers, or addressing job creation, or how we look to upgrade skills and capabilities, how we address things like fair remuneration in the workplace, how we embrace diversity and inclusion through the value chains. These are all kind of core social imperatives. And these are also pretty essential to our value chains being able to be more sustainable. And by the way, I think there's a very strong interrelationship as we address these sort of big systemic issues and societal challenges between the overlap between how we address poverty and how we invest behind social impact and the impacts that that itself has on environmental considerations and public health. Now for us, that's really about the fact that as a company, we have to start to think much more about how we're making our money rather than what we do with the money that we make. And that differentiation is quite a significant shift. And so for my own company, some of that's been around how our corporate purpose actually really drives everything that we're doing and the impact that we think we can have on the world. And so we have a purpose. We talk about existing to protect, heal, and nurture in the relentless pursuit of a cleaner, healthier world. And so all of our global brands, we have a built-in and hot-wired into those brands a purpose to support the delivery of the SDGs, or an SDG specifically. And we have an ambition that by 2030, we want to at least reach half the world with those brands that can actually help and enable people to live cleaner and healthier lives. And we've also adopted a series of sustainability ambitions, which are going to apply to us from 2030. And that also includes a commitment to be net zero by 2040. And that has real and significant implications for the way that we run our business, but also where we're going to invest. Basically, it's going to drive where and how we source. We do need to source more sustainably. So that's about sustainable raw materials and key ingredients. It's about how we innovate, everything from redesigning and redefining our approach to things like packaging and the way that we use key ingredients that are more sustainable. It's about how we green our operations. So a lot of that is about infrastructure and distribution systems. And it's about the way that we market, because we have to encourage more sustainable purchasing, but also more sustainable consumption patterns. And that's absolutely key to our ability to unlock and deliver on our net zero ambitions. If you are a consumer branded business like mine, what we know is that 70% of the embedded carbon in our brands are actually in the way that the consumer or the person who buys our product uses it and what happens at the end of life. So this is really important. If we can only achieve a significant or make significant progress towards net zero and our net zero ambitions if we can engage directly in changing those consumption patterns. So that actually does require us to have both a multilateral, multi-sector solutions, and those solutions have to involve both the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector working together and forming new ways of collaborating. And you'll have heard, I hope from my CEO, that governments, of course, have an enormous role in creating that kind of right enabling environment. And he highlighted 3 examples, and I'm sorry, I am going to repeat them because I just think it's helpful to do that for you, of where we think that some things are going to be key to making a difference. And the first is really around procurement. We have, and are being challenged to do so. I mean, it's important to acknowledge and recognize that this is something that our consumers around the world, and it's not limited to developing nations, but it's pretty much a global trend, have an expectation that we will be using materials and raw materials which are more sustainable. That is to say, both from an environmental and from a social point of view. And we have set our own internal positive procurement policies. And the point, however, yet, is that we're not really seeing the benefit of that in terms of how those efforts are kind of being recognized or rewarded in the external world. And so ways in which we can promote the reduction of tariffs on more sustainable materials or on finished goods are certainly going to accelerate our ability to make that transition. I think secondly, of course, we have a lot of dialogue about what this means, this establishment of this so-called circular economy. And what we know today is that only about 8% of the global economy could be deemed to be circular today. And if we're going to make the progress that we need to make by 2030, which I think is only literally a few years away, we have to find ways that are going to develop sort of global standards for stimulating reverse infrastructure in our supply chains. And that's going to be a critical area of focus for us. And thirdly, and lastly, I think we have to green all of our manufacturing and distribution systems. And that does mean that we have to accelerate the adoption of low carbon technologies. And that technologies for us like hydrogen will be pretty essential to that. So how we can stimulate faster adoption of those greener alternatives will be key to our investment decisions and our investment flows. So just the last comment is to say that obviously a stable and an open global trading system is critical for this. And if we don't have stable trade policies, that's only likely to both increase the cost and reduce the pace of future investment. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning.
Thank you, Miguel, and thanks in particular for bringing up the points around the role of sustainable procurement and the importance of investing in human and social issues such as treatment to migrant workers. We now turn to our final speaker, Professor Manova, over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a pleasure to be part of this panel. The speakers ahead of me have already very eloquently summarized some of the major challenges and opportunities that arise in the context of global value chains and foreign direct investment. So what I would like to do today is share with you a few systematic messages that are emerging from the recent academic literature. And of course, global value chains in general, and specifically in the context of COVID and other global shocks, have certainly been at the frontier of that kind of academic research in international trade and investment. I would say that there are three important messages emerging from academic research. And I'm summarizing here evidence from my own work, but of course the literature in general. So let me organize this by thinking about the returns to global value chains, so the opportunities for individual firms and aggregate economies. Then turn to thinking about the risks and challenges of global value chains, again at the firm and macro level. And finally, discuss some of the lessons we have learned from COVID. And throughout, I will think about policy implications as well. So when we think about the returns to global value chains, it's useful to consider the perspective of both rich and more developing emerging economies. For developed countries, their firms are very actively participating in the global market by sourcing inputs upstream from emerging economies, or by pursuing foreign direct investment and offshoring certain production steps abroad. Clearly, this brings tremendous efficiency gains for these kind of firms. And of course, in global value chains, there are also a lot of pro-competitive gains. The fact that you can, in principle, source from multiple suppliers will one way or another lead you to access higher quality inputs at lower prices and lower markups. What about developing countries? There certainly have been widespread gains upstream to developing countries as well. And from their perspective, having access to technological blueprints, imported inputs of high quality that are not available at home has been tremendously important, because access to this kind of technology and production materials has enabled them to themselves increase the quality and efficiency of their output production processes. And from their perspective, being able to tap large export markets is key for short-term performance and profitability, as well as for long-run growth. And of course, the most promising destination markets for developing countries are in fact rich developed economies that do have certain quality and reliability standards. It's also worth remembering that there is a firm life cycle, there is a macro structural transformation process in developing countries, and there certainly are policy concerns about emerging economies being stuck in certain segments of the value chain that are not only offering less value added short term, but perhaps more limited growth prospects long run. And the encouraging news that's emerging from the academic literature is that it's not borne out in the data. In the data, what we do see systematically is that firms in developing countries begin participating in the global economy by performing narrower segments of the value chain. And over time, they're able to build capacity and financial capabilities to expand along the value chain, capture more segments, increase value added and profits. So in terms of policy implications, one message that is pretty clear is that we need to insist on low barriers to trade. And that means not just shipping goods, but also allowing passenger travel, and critically enabling the matching of buyers and suppliers in the global marketplace. These matching costs are high, not because of the IT infrastructure itself. Institutions are absolutely first order. So it is extremely important to ensure stable contract enforcement and reliable logistics. One advantage of COVID has been the much wider adoption of blockchain and other digital technologies by SMEs in developing countries and in the rich West. And this kind of institutional strength and reliability, automation in contracting, I think, is fundamental for unlocking all those opportunities global value chains offer. What about the challenges to global value chains? Let's leave steady state aside. One might worry about steady state context, but let's think about shocks. Idiosyncratic shocks that hit one country or one firm or one sector are very different from global shocks. Idiosyncratic shocks might actually affect few firms in the economy that find ways to overcome this temporary imperfect situation in supply or demand conditions. And these kind of limited shocks will not have an implication on macro outcomes, unless, of course, they hit some really large, important firms that are interconnected in the global market and might therefore spill over these shocks on the global sphere. Global shocks are extremely different and very important because they usually imply that multiple countries and sectors that are interconnected in the network will suffer at the same time. And this might amplify supply and demand shocks in one country and another, such that the whole impact of this initial shock is much amplified. So the most important policy implication here is to think about providing structures that allow countries to react to global shocks. I think for treating those idiosyncratic country or sector-specific shocks, we probably need to have different tools in place. Yes, there may be arguments for, too big to fail sectors and firms, but in general, I think the policy efforts should be targeting how we handle global shocks. And here, the scope for multilateralism is absolutely present and without doubt. So in conclusion, let me think about a few lessons that have emerged from the recent COVID experience. COVID has been an unprecedented shock in many respects. It has been extremely large and prolonged. It has been global, but highly asynchronous in that different countries were hit at different times. And while COVID started perhaps as a supply shock in China, in that a lot of plants shut down production, it quickly became a demand shock globally and a supply shock globally as health conditions deteriorated worldwide. But because it was asynchronous, some countries were recovering much faster than others. By the time China was back online, the Western European countries and much of the Americas were being hit hard. And I think this asynchronous nature was the main reason why initial impetus towards multilateralism and collaboration unfortunately failed. And it's been ebb and flow ever since. I'd like to believe that now the push towards multilateralism will dominate, in that more countries and sectors will appreciate the potential scope for mutual benefits. The main takeaway, I think, is that there's certainly trade-offs when we think about efficiency and diversification. From the perspective of individual companies, it may not be efficient, it may not be advantageous to diversify their supply chain if all they expect are small, infrequent, isolated shocks. The more we believe that global shocks will become the norm, the more important it becomes to enable companies to diversify their supply chain. And this will necessitate institutional action, making sure that contract enforcement is strong, making sure that the right platforms exist for firms to meet buyers and suppliers. So let me end here by just saying the efficiency diversification trade-offs are first order, institutions matter, and the frequency and nature of shocks matters. And for that reason, we do need to think, are there certain sectors of national security that require different treatment and are especially ripe for multilateral action? Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Well, we've heard so many ideas that my head anyway is spinning. I think early on there was quite some focus in the discussion around investment facilitation for development. Just from the World Economic Forum perspective, that's something we see as very important. We've had a large program on trade facilitation for many years, done some e-commerce facilitation, and have been building up for a couple of years an investment facilitation program, working together with business, several countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so are eagerly supporting the progress at the JSI, but not necessarily waiting for it. We think that local actors have good visibility of what needs to be done, and they really just need the resources to scale. So I think we have time now for just a couple of questions. Maybe what we should do first is see whether there's any quick clarification or reactions any of our speakers would like to ask of each other, because I'm sure if you were unsure of anything, then our viewers will be too. So did anybody want to come in with quick questions to each other or clarification of points? No, well, you were all extremely clear. So let me throw in maybe a couple of thoughts, and hopefully I can get some reactions to them. So maybe 3 points here. First point is that I think the concern with resilience, which we've been hearing, potentially means that, well, presumably means that we should aim for more diverse economy, more diverse supply. And so does that mean that this is perhaps a development opportunity for Africa, for Latin America, which have not been as well integrated into global value chains? Maybe a second point is that the best policies in the world are useless, unfortunately, if they're not actually implemented. And so what have people seen as some best practice on where things are actually being implemented? You know, where trade investment facilitation, for example, is actually occurring. And then a third point, and I think Joel referred to this, is that, you know, one of the biggest impacts of the pandemic has been on the movement of people, whether that's migrant workers, tourists, business travelers. And so can trade and investment policy respond to be more welcoming to people? So let's get a couple of thoughts there. Joel, I see you've put your hand up. Would you like to start?
Well, I had put my hand up in response to your very first question, if we had anything to ask of each other. And I did have a question I wanted to pose to the last speaker, Professor Manova. And she did mention the whole issue of, and I do agree in terms of thinking about providing structures to help countries respond to global shock. I was wondering if she could have unpacked that a bit more and walk us through what some of these structures could potentially look like. So that's the question I wanted to pose, but seeing that I have the floor, you did ask a question, your last question about being a bit more welcoming, inviting of people and so forth. And I think the pandemic, and I spoke quickly about the role of the WTO at the end of my intervention, but I think the pandemic has exposed the extent to which we need to update some of our trade rules. So for example, rules governing the movement of natural people. We may have certain bilateral agreements that govern these things, but we saw during the pandemic where restrictions were imposed, or we saw situations that perhaps if we had more facilitative environments multilaterally, which govern the movement of medical professionals, for example, that we could perhaps have seen a different kind of response on the ground and the cooperation between countries to the pandemic. So I think there is definitely a need to update some of our trade rules, especially our services rules, movement of professionals, working on mutual recognition agreements as well. This is something that even in our agreement with the European Union, the Economic Partnership Agreement, we do have provisions on mutual recognition of qualification, but I believe that these things we now need to start multilateralizing some of these disciplines that already exist at the bilateral level. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Kalina, do you want to address the question?
Of course, I think this is a first order question. What is it that governments can do in practice? And of course, there's no silver bullet. There's no simple answer. To my mind, there are two things companies need. They need information and they need financing. What does that mean in practice? Well, because of the efficiency diversification trade-off, you will automatically look for your most advantageous supplier. Building relationships is very difficult, not just because of establishing trust and reputation, but because effective supplier-buyer relationships require a lot of relationship-specific investments and customization. This is especially the case the more technologically sophisticated a product becomes. Your little chip is not going to fit my downstream product. Last minute, should something happen to you, it's very hard for me to turn around and find an alternative supplier. And if you think about the Japanese earthquake a decade ago, this is precisely what happened to Toyota. For about 3 months, they shut down all plant operations and produced not a single car in the US. Why? Because they couldn't find alternative suppliers short term. Was it advantageous for them to do so? Not necessarily, because they did anticipate this was going to be a very short-lived shock. Building those new relationships, customizing those products is not worth it when they know they're going to go back online. So what that means is that idiosyncratic shocks are very different from global shocks. So I think from a policy perspective, it makes sense to put structures in place that give companies knowledge and funding to overcome those more systemic shocks. Knowledge means let's have a data collection and data disclosure effort such that we have information on the complex supplier networks. Unfortunately, what we experienced during COVID is that what matters is not just the first-tier suppliers, but second-tier suppliers. And the previous speaker before me alluded to that. Many companies found that they had no alternative suppliers, or they did not expect any disruptions to their supply chain because they assumed their immediate suppliers will be okay, not realizing that their second-tier suppliers were in fact the ones hit hardest by the crisis. So having that information is critical. Financing is very important, especially if you need to react quickly to an unexpected big shock, especially if you need to establish new partnerships, you need funding to do so or short notice. And this jives very importantly with global value chains. In many countries, there are export credit agencies in place that function more or less efficiently, but very often they have pretty restrictive requirements on domestic content in production. The more we fragment production across borders, the lower domestic value added will be in my final good. This is not necessarily bad. I am creating jobs at home I might not have been had I not had access to, cheaper inputs supplied from abroad. So making sure that these ECA financing rules are not too restrictive on firms, I think, is also important. To the extent that that's not possible, then enabling fast-track bank credit in situations of global shocks that hit supply chain operations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we actually have a, I think, somewhat related question from the audience, which I think, Miguel, is probably directed to you. And it's about, I guess, the increased priority which is being put to inventories in order to respond to these sorts of shocks, and whether this is going to have much of an effect on, I guess, your trade and investment policy, trade and investment plans.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for the question. I think it's fair to say, I think the question actually relates to whether we're going to go from a just-in-time to a just-in-case model. I think it's fair to say the challenge we've had in the first instance is actually delivering on the just-in-time commitments that we have. And clearly, we're already still seeing and experiencing some shocks in our ability to move products around at the moment, just because of all of the challenges that we see in the global value chains. Our view of this, and I mentioned it earlier, and I think it's also to pick up on the comment that my colleagues just made, is that when you look at value chains, you do start to have to look much deeper in the value chains and understand the interconnected nature of them. And that is something that we're looking at in the first instance. So it's building longer term relationships with key partners in our supply chain, securing those partnerships and agreements, and then understanding their ability to withstand shocks within that's going to be pretty essential. Second, though, I think this idea of inventory, it clearly really depends on what your portfolio is, what kind of products you sell. In some cases, you have products that it's difficult to build inventory for long-term inventory and stockage, and particularly difficult when you actually don't have much of a sense of when the next shock might happen. So there is an element of looking at this, how you can build resilience within your value chains by trying to sort of understand where and how these shocks may come, but it's difficult to plan, and certainly we're looking at how we are sourcing and where we're sourcing. Hedging is also key at the moment to how we're looking at the longer term. But yeah, I think it's a very difficult and unpredictable environment in which we find ourselves at the moment.
Great, thank you. Let me try and bring in Carlo and Sunghoan again. Maybe your reactions to these points around, is the search for resilience an opportunity for development for those countries which have struggled in being involved in global value chains? Are you seeing practical opportunities to accelerate the implementation of investment facilitation? What are some of your thoughts? Carlo first, then someone.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Now, of course, from the point of view of let's say policymakers or government, we can also only hope so. We can only try to do our best to create the conditions, because this is the role, but not only to create the possible rules and the best possible environment, also with our partners at home and with our close partners. We do implement. We have a very ambitious, I didn't mention it in my intervention, we had a very ambitious also financing plan. The external investment plan for the EU is the equivalent to our EU Invest plan for what we are trying to do at home to leverage a lot of private investment. With the external investment plan, we want to leverage through public financing as much as possible, 3 or 4 times or 5 times more private investment in particular in our neighborhood and in Africa, first of all. And together with this, what my role is not so much on the financing, but it's more on the rules side, on agreeing on certain basic rules that accompany, and a lot of them will be sort of investment facilitation type of rules that create the possible best environment to attract those private companies that we hope will come in. And of course, the diversification can be an opportunity provided all the rest of conditions are there. Because yes, companies we hear, they have learned a lot from this experience, but there has to be a supplier, there has to be you know, a real alternative. The conditions have to be right, the stability has to be there, the credibility, the enforcement of contracts have to be there. So those are basic conditions. So if in addition companies realize that they need to diversify, I think absolutely yes. Now, of course, if there are internal political choices made that even exacerbate the problems created by the pandemic, well, then that's, and of course, I'm not referring to any country close to the EU in particular, but I mean, this is completely self-induced. So, and similarly to a point that Joel made on the question, the third question you made about the movements of people, and indeed this is a fundamental issue that we've seen during the pandemic. What happened? The people stopped moving from one day to the other, which means the services industry, the tourism industry, simply stopped like that. So that vulnerability we have to look at. I'm not sure if the response to making sure that people can move in a safe way, that can continue to move. I'm talking about the tourism industry. I'm not sure that the only response has to be found in trade rules. Trade rules are designed on business person, provider of services, but the mass of people in the tourism industry, I think we need to find a sort of international cooperation at a different level as well, recognition of vaccines or things like that, that I think we've seen some pretty heavy hiccups there, even between developed countries, unfortunately, from that point of view. And I think there's a lot better that we can do. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Carlo. Someone can take 2 minutes.
Thank you. Regarding the question, I think the question really boils down to whether resilience in the mid to long term will generate greater impetus towards globalization, as was mentioned by many, or towards reshoring and localization or regionalization. And notwithstanding what I've heard about the downsides of reshoring, I think it's too early to say. I think the jury is still out whether, notwithstanding what our ambitions are, what our desires are, whether the quest for greater resilience in light of all the events that have happened, in addition to, as I mentioned, the longer term trends of anemic FDI growth, whether all of this will spell for accelerated globalization or reshoring and localization, I think we have yet to see. And what compounds the uncertainty here is, I think, maybe not the 700-pound gorilla, but the 300-pound gorilla, namely the move to decouple high-tech areas of supply chains, global value chains, and sensitive technology areas, high-tech areas, much of which the Korean economy, for instance, is dependent on, and much of which drives the Korean economy. So those elements will also make for uncertainty. And so those two broader trends combine together to make it uncertain to say whether resilience, the quest for resilience, will actually accelerate globalization. I think the jury is still out. Just on the final point about the movement of people, I would agree with what Carlos said. Just right after the pandemic struck, we had to reach out to our key investment destinations to make sure that our business people, our technicians, our engineers can fly to those investments, those billion-dollar investments, to make sure the factories keep running, because that required their expertise. And the stoppage of these factories creates huge economic losses. So as Joel pointed out, the movement of essential business people, not just medical people, but essential business people, are also key to the functioning of the global economy. Now, does that mean we need global trade rules that address those, or other options? And I think, again, here, perhaps a little more thought needs to go into what it is that needs, what would be the best approach to address that. But certainly, I would agree that international framework of some kind, greater international collaboration would be needed. And that is one thing that really does have to come out of this pandemic crisis. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're coming right to the end of our session, so we just have time for 2 minutes of concluding remarks from each of our organizers, WTO and UNCTAD. So first, Mark, what do you take away from today? You're on mute, Mark.
Yeah, 2 quick points. The first one being that one takeaway for me is really that it was very useful to have this conversation on both trade and investment, because of often here in Geneva, we either focus on one or the other, and bringing together people who work on investment and on trade, I thought was very, very useful, and clearly investment and trade go hand in hand, so it makes perfect sense, and we don't do that often enough. The second quick remark is on a point that was just raised at some point by Miguel, but which I think was maybe not sufficiently emphasized, which is that it's important to accompany the measures discussed that we discussed and that I discussed, in particular in my presentation of the World Trade Report, measures that facilitate trade with measures to increase the participation of the poor and in trade reforms and to make the trade more inclusive. And I suppose again, Miguel has eloquently explained that this is important, and I want to just point out that I fully agree with that, and that it's a very important thing. In relation to this inclusiveness, let me quickly mention the fact that yesterday night it was announced that WTO members have come to a consensus on a declaration on MSMEs' participation in trade. This is sufficiently rare to be underlined, and I just wanted to mention this, and I hope it sort of augurs well for MC12 and for all the work that remains to be done.
Thank you, Mark. And Richard, what are your conclusions?
Thank you very much, Sean. Well, first of all, really, I'd like to thank all of the speakers and panelists. I think it was an extremely interesting session, and really in the spirit of the World Investment Forum, bringing together the international organizations, policymakers, business and academia, all in one room to talk about investment for development. So it's really great. Just 3 very quick points on what I've heard. So really investment facilitation, very much needed, to reverse the slowdown in growth and investment that someone was talking about early on, and also to reverse the shift, or reverse, or to complement the shift from industry investment to infrastructure. There's too much going to infrastructure, which is great because a lot of that is SDG type investment, but we need also to facilitate the investment in industry. So that's an important one. Then I really liked also how Carlo early on built on what DSG also mentioned in her address, which is the fact that some of the big risks that we're trying to deal with for investors really occur very, very rarely. And some of the more important things that are really the high impact things that will attract most investment are just about information provision, are about transparency, and about streamlining administrative procedures. So that's also very much what we focus on. It's kind of an 80-20 approach to investment facilitation, You can do 20% of the activities to get 80% of the benefits from it. And the last point, investment facilitation will require on the part, and I echo Joel here in what he said, technical assistance on the part of many developing countries to really get to reap the benefits from it. Those are my 3 points. Thank you so much, Sean. Over to you.
Well, with that, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. Goodbye.